25 years of service. That's what Darius has to do in order to become an Imperial citizen. The Central Empire has broken into 3 parts. For some, this is a disaster, but others, an opportunity. From the Sturgeon Mountains to the Azuri deserts, clans are mustering and banners are being raised. The call to arms is heard. Village elders, merchants, and those who can't fight are worried. Young men from all over Calradia set out for glory and ambition. With Ironman mode on, my challenge is to create a realistic story. I will roleplay Darius as he embarks not for world conquest, but to enlist as a simple soldier to endure and survive the wars to come for 25 in-game years. At 20 years of age, Darius is ready to go out into the world and leave his homeland. No armour or respectable weapons, Darius needs money. Using his old mule, he'd been transporting and trading hardwood to Britannian cities. It didn't make him a lot of money, but it was enough to get started. For a modest pay, he hired a couple of clansmen to help him. With extra hands, he could transport more and take more dangerous trade routes. Without the help, Darius would certainly be in trouble. With his new help at Maranath, he made a good profit, selling some prisoners, some old rags, and some furs. Darius spent all of spring and early summer trading in furs to make what money he could. He'd used the money to travel west, buy himself some respectable armour and some decent weapons. With a heavier purse, he gathered what supplies he could for the long journey west. It would take weeks. Darius had his eyes set on the city of Danustica. He heard the Imperial armies were mustering there, and the pay was too good to refuse. On his first day travelling west, a bunch of highwaymen stopped him. He had no choice but to hand over a handful of coins and his mule. This could have gone a lot worse. Darius went further and further west over the next coming weeks. He was infatuated with the Imperial architecture, much stronger than that of his Britannian homes he's so used to. He walked most of the streets, fascinated by the amount of produce, the amount of people, and all the different wares, everywhere you looked. They read a lot more here. The guards were completely different, no tartan. And the inns were as good as any. He visited Lycaon, Venera, with its famous golden eagle, although he doubted it was actually made of gold. And then finally, he arrived at Danustica. It was too late. Most of the armies had already mustered and moved out. So before joining the army, he would need to get himself some new armour and some better weapons. With the money he had, he was able to buy some half-decent leather armour. It will do. He also purchased himself an iron spatha, a cavalry sword turned infantry. This would do him nicely. He also noticed that food was selling here for an extortionate rate, which was a telltale sign that an army had just passed through. The Imperial armies could be campaigning for the better part of summer. It wouldn't be until winter that I could potentially join. He kept himself busy though. The local tournaments were a lot easier to compete in, seeing as most of the men were off at war. His first tournament win rewarded him with a decent helmet. Now properly equipped, he joined a local militia group. The pay wasn't great, but they got a lot of things done. They were fighting highwaymen and doing trade routes for local merchants. They landed a job to acquire some cattle from a nearby village. However, upon arriving at the village, it had been raided and there was not much inhabitants there. They were forced to go further north. This took them into the snowy areas as winter was encroaching. They got all the cattle they needed and they head back to the merchant and made themselves quite a bit of good money. Darius spent most of winter and the early spring months with the militia group, travelling from city to city. He'd always take the opportunity to join in a local tournament. Sometimes he'd win, sometimes he wouldn't get far. The militia group was perfecting the art of fighting against highwaymen and looters. They would seize the plunder and sell it to cities. They'd also take any prisoners they could and make a nice profit. With spring in full blossom, Darius made his way back over to Danustica. It was a fresh campaigning season, and the army was recruiting. Darius entered his first year of service during spring 1085. He had 25 years left until he became an Imperial citizen. Summer 1084, the Western Empire declares war on the Southern Empire. A once peaceful border turned into a front line. The armies were gathering at Vicon, where a tournament was being held before the march to war. A lot of notable people were entering. Darius made it to the end, where he'd fight against a very reputable lord called Faron. Darius wins the tournament by defeating Faron. More importantly, he wins the respect of his brothers in arms. The Siege of Onika Castle, autumn 1085. This siege would ignite what would be the start of many stories to come. This was Darius' first large-scale battle. Morale was very high as the enemy was outnumbered 4-1. This was the start of the summer campaign, a textbook siege, an easy victory, and all the soldiers played their part perfectly. Knowing they had an advantage, young soldiers and Darius were eager to get up the ladders and inside the castle. Darius was in awe as he reached the top of the siege tower. This was chaos, so much carnage in a small amount of space. He was careful not to fall off the wall and helped his comrades push into the gatehouse. Somehow Darius found himself at the front as blows came smashing down towards his shield. His life was nearly taken. Once his comrades made it into the gatehouse, he was able to break free and slay a couple of enemies for the first time in a battle like this. As quick as it began, it was over. A short, sweet taste of victory. Darius craved more. A few weeks later, on the border between the two fractured empires, they met again, this time in the field of battle. Darius and the Southern Empire started the battle by holding their ground. As the enemy came closer, the Western Empire sent volley after volley of arrows into our shield formation. Then they sent their cavalry. And finally, that's when they hit us hard with their infantry. Darius found himself fighting against a heavy Imperial legionary who almost took his life, if not for the chaos. They would go on to win this battle, but the war was far from over. A couple of days later, they met again on an open field. This time the enemy was holding ground, as we sent our cavalry in first. We then rained arrow fire down on their ranks. This caused them to break formation and charge our line of bowmen. This caught us off guard and they did some good damage, but it wasn't enough for when we sent in our infantry. The momentum of our infantry swept over the battlefield, causing the enemy to rout. The momentum carried into the night. In this battle there was no skirmish phase, as both infantry lines crashed into each other. Scouts reported the Western Empire had been reinforced, but with such high morale the Southern Empire was happy to face them in a pitched battle. After the skirmish phase, their cavalry smashed into our lines, following closely behind with their infantry. This is a bloody battle. With barely room to fight, the air was filled with blood and sweat, and the screams of the dying. The battle went on longer than any other battle Darius had been a part of. There was a squeeze from all sides as the fighting got more and more intense. Something wasn't right. Finally, Darius made himself to the outside of the fight, where he looked out over the enemy lines. Despite hitting both sides, the Western Empire was firing arrows into the melee. As far as he could see, enemy reinforcements were coming. He takes another arrow and falls to the ground. This total defeat made any previous victories completely worthless. What ground was taken has now been reclaimed, and the once young and eager soldiers of the Southern Empire had just learnt their most valuable lesson. Although this is a time of war, they are all Imperials. They took a lot of prisoners rather than executing anyone. Darius was fortunate. He was taken into captivity and his wounds tended to. I really hope you enjoyed this style of roleplay storytelling. Remember, there is no loading of saves, so whatever happens to Darius happens. Thank you for watching. Please look out for the next one, and most importantly, glory to the Empire.